Did your family have favorites? If so, were you the favorite or someone else?
There's something cruelly theatrical about a family dinner on a Friday night, the kind where the meat is perfectly seared, the wine is aged just right, and the house smells like rosemary and garlic and all the illusions that come with them. Where every detail is curated to suggest unity and warmth, but under the polished silverware and polite laughter, there's a script everyone's memorized too well to even pretend it's real anymore. And last Friday, I walked into my parents' dining room knowing exactly how it would go because it always goes the same way. My mom with her tight smile and her white wine buzz, my dad with his quiet disapproval disguised as dry humor, and my older brother Jake sitting like the golden child who never stopped being valedictorian, even if we're all pushing 40 now. Jake had flown in from Washington, D.C., which, in case you didn't know, is apparently shorthand in our family for made it. He works in policy, some vague, important-sounding department that no one at the table understands, but everyone pretends to admire. My mom greeted him like a soldier returning from war, arms wide, voice high, already asking what time his flight lands next time. My dad clapped him on the back and said, "There's my guy," with that proud gleam in his eyes he never, not once, directed at me. I came in carrying a homemade peach crumble, something I baked that morning because I knew nobody would expect me to bring anything, and sometimes I like doing things no one asked me for. Sometimes, it's the only way I still feel like I exist in that house. Dinner started predictably. My mom asked Jake about some conference in Chicago, my dad threw in a comment about inflation and how the country's going to hell, and Jake responded like a seasoned politician, charismatic, calm, and just detached enough to remind you he belongs somewhere more important. I took my seat at the far end of the table, opposite Jake, like always, and said nothing for the first 10 minutes. I just smiled, nodded, and chewed my roast, waiting for someone to ask how my week was, even though I knew they wouldn't. I could have told them about the promotion I got at the marketing firm I've been grinding at for the past 7 years, or the fact that I'd finally signed a lease on a place I actually liked, not just one I could afford. But I knew it wouldn't matter. I wasn't Jake. I was never Jake. The conversation drifted, the wine flowed, and just as I thought maybe, just maybe, we'd get through one damn dinner without someone drawing a comparison, my dad leaned back, sipped his scotch, looked directly at me, and said with the kind of smirk that dares you to react, "We always knew your brother would go far. You? Not so much." I didn't flinch. I didn't speak. I didn't even look surprised, because honestly, I wasn't. It wasn't the first time he'd said something like that, and I knew it wouldn't be the last. I just reached for the salt shaker, held it steady in my hand, and passed it across the table slow, deliberate, and without breaking eye contact. I think that unnerved him more than anything I could have said. Silence has a way of echoing louder than rage when someone expects you to break. The room got quiet, just for a beat. Jake coughed into his napkin, Mom reached for more potatoes like she didn't hear a thing, and I resumed cutting my roast. That was it. No drama, no tears, just a well-placed silence that somehow hollowed out the room. Now, here's the part that I haven't stopped thinking about since. Yesterday, Jake called me. Now let me be clear, Jake doesn't call me. We text on holidays, send each other the occasional meme out of obligation, but actual phone calls? Never. So when I saw his name on my screen, I picked up out of pure curiosity. His voice was tight, like he was holding something in. And the first thing he said, no greeting, no small talk, was, "What did you say to Dad?" I blinked. "What are you talking about?" "He's locked himself in his room," Jake said, sounding more bewildered than concerned. "Mom says he hasn't come out since dinner. He's not answering his phone. He didn't go to the club this morning. He's crying." That word hung in the air like fog, crying. My dad doesn't cry. My dad barely blinks when people die. I've seen that man hum while trimming hedges at funerals. He's the kind of guy who calls emotions indulgent. And now I'm hearing from his prize-winning son that he's holed up in his bedroom, weeping? I didn't say anything, I told Jake, and it was true. I hadn't. "Yeah, but you looked at him like you knew something." I didn't respond. Mostly because I didn't know what to say. Partly because he was right. See, something changed for me at that table. Not because of what my dad said, it's nothing I hadn't heard a dozen times before, but because of how I chose to handle it. I didn't explode. I didn't plead for validation. I didn't try to prove anything. I just let the weight of his own words sit in the silence with him. I passed the salt, and in that small, calculated moment, I finally stopped playing my part in the family script. I didn't react. And for the first time, he had to sit with his own cruelty, without a punchline, without a deflection, without a daughter desperate to win him over. Maybe that's what broke him. Or maybe it was something else, something I didn't even know I was saying with my silence. But now I can't stop thinking about that call. About Jake's confusion. My dad's breakdown. The possibility that, in doing nothing, I finally did something. And if that's true, if just passing the salt could shatter the image he's clung to all these years, what happens if I actually say something? That thought's been circling me like a vulture. Because I've stayed quiet for decades. And suddenly, the silence is louder than any scream I've ever buried. The thing about silence is that once you finally let it speak for you, once you give it enough space to echo through the walls you never thought would crack, it doesn't just stop, it keeps vibrating, filling in the blanks of every conversation you never had, answering questions no one dared to ask, and exposing truths everyone worked so damn hard to bury under polite smiles, dry chuckles, and second helpings of mashed potatoes. After Jake called to tell me that Dad was locked in his bedroom and crying, actually crying, I couldn't stop picturing it, and not because I felt guilty or confused, but because the very idea of him breaking down after all these years of bulletproof control felt not only surreal, but almost poetic. That night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed under the sheets, my mind spinning with every version of the dinner I could replay, wondering what the hell triggered it. Was it just the silence? Was it the eye contact? Or was it something deeper, something he'd been trying to avoid confronting for years, something he saw reflected in me at that table and just couldn't swallow this time? I kept remembering that flicker in his face, the moment right after I passed him the salt, and the way he blinked just a second too long, like something had finally landed. I kept thinking, what if it wasn't just me he saw? What if he saw her? It had been a long time since I thought about her, at least in any real, meaningful way that didn't involve shame or resentment or just shutting down completely, and yet that night, lying there in the dark, I couldn't stop the memory from rolling in like a slow tide I didn't even know was coming. Her name was Claire. My sister. Technically half-sister, but blood doesn't fraction feelings. She was older than both Jake and me, born from a chapter of Dad's life that no one in the family talked about, ever, not even in hushed tones after one too many drinks. She was the unspoken one, the deleted file, the faded photograph you pretend isn't in the box of family keepsakes, except I knew she existed because I met her once. I was 13. It was at a gas station just off I-95. My mom never forgave my dad for that day. She had long brown hair, thick like mine, and her smile looked like something torn from my own face. I remember watching her walk away after 5 awkward minutes of adult small talk, and I felt this strange, hollow sense of familiarity I couldn't explain, like I'd just been introduced to a part of myself I wasn't supposed to meet. After that day, she vanished again, folded back into the shadows of whatever private shame my dad kept locked away. I never saw her again. No one did. But the older I got, the more I wondered if the silence around her wasn't just avoidance, it was guilt. The next morning, curiosity gnawed at me like a slow burn in my gut, the kind you try to ignore with coffee and to-do lists, but ends up coloring every second of your day, so I called my mom. She answered on the second ring, her voice already tight and defensive, like she knew why I was calling and didn't want to give me the satisfaction. "He's still in the bedroom," she said, before I could ask. I left food outside the door, but he hasn't touched it. There was a long pause after that, the kind that fills with static tension when no one wants to be the first to step into the minefield. I asked, "Did something happen?" "Before dinner, I mean." She sighed, a long, weary sound that seemed to carry the weight of decades. "You know how he gets. Your father has always had a way of holding things in. That's not new." But that wasn't an answer. It was a dodge, the kind I was used to from her. And I didn't have the energy to wrestle for the truth through a dozen layers of passive aggression, so I changed tactics. "I want to come over," I said. "Why?" She snapped a little too quickly. "To check on him," I replied, though we both knew that was only half the reason. An hour later, I pulled into the driveway of the house I grew up in, the one where love was always conditional and comfort came with a performance review. Mom didn't open the door when I rang, she just yelled for me to come in, like I was still 16 and grounded for missing curfew. The place looked the same, framed family photos that excluded Claire, beige carpet that hadn't been updated since the Clinton administration, and the smell of lemon polish and old secrets. I didn't ask permission. I walked straight down the hall, past the dining room where it all began, and stopped outside my father's door. I didn't knock. I just stood there, listening. Nothing. No rustling, no pacing, no breathing. Just silence. It felt like he was trying to disappear. I don't know what made me do it, but I turned away from the door and headed to the guest room, the one that used to be my dad's home office before he retired. I remembered, faintly, that he used to keep an old metal file cabinet in the closet, locked and dusty, filled with God knows what, contracts, tax returns, family artifacts no one wanted to face. I opened the closet. The cabinet was still there, but the lock was broken. The drawer slid open with a whine, and right at the back, almost hidden behind folders of old insurance documents, was a small cardboard box, unmarked, like it had been shoved there quickly, as an afterthought. I pulled it out, sat on the floor, and opened the flaps. Inside, there were photographs, dozens of them, of Claire. Some with Dad. A few with a woman I didn't recognize. There was a birthday card, folded and never mailed, addressed to her in handwriting I hadn't seen in years, but knew instantly as his. There were letters, too, unopened, sent from her to him. One dated only 6 months ago. I don't know how long I sat there, reading, staring, piecing things together that no one had ever offered me. But I do know that for the first time in my life, I understood something I never thought possible. My father's shame wasn't just about failure or pride or disappointment in me, it was about regret. And not the kind you speak out loud. The kind that festers for decades, calcifies into cruelty, and spills out in twisted ways that hurt the wrong people at the wrong time. When I stood up, I knew something had shifted. Not just in me, but in the entire narrative I had been fed since I was a child. I put the box back exactly as I found it, closed the closet, and left the room. And as I walked past my father's door, still closed, still silent, I smiled for the first time in days. Because now I had something he didn't know I knew. And I wasn't done being quiet. Not yet. There's a strange clarity that comes when you discover a truth no one wanted you to find. Especially when that truth has been buried so deep in your family's foundation that exposing it feels like kicking loose the first brick of a house that was never as solid as everyone pretended. After I found the box, those letters, those pictures, that unopened card, I didn't drive home. I couldn't. I sat in my car for over an hour in their driveway, staring out at the same magnolia tree I used to climb when I was 9, the one that still had the rusted nail in the bark where Jake once hung a homemade birdhouse, the one I wasn't allowed to touch because that's your brother's, as if ownership of branches was the same as ownership of affection. I sat there trying to piece together what exactly I'd just uncovered, but the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about Claire or the missing pieces in my dad's story, it was about the way silence has always been weaponized. In our family, a cold, clean blade passed around like inheritance. Later that night, back at my apartment, the ache in my chest had grown into something tight and restless, something that wouldn't let me sit still. I poured a glass of wine, stared at the unopened letters I had photographed with my phone, because yes, I'd taken pictures, every page of every letter, every address, every date, and opened my laptop. I didn't know what I was looking for, not really. Maybe some trace of Claire, a Facebook page, a LinkedIn account, something to prove she was still alive and not just another family myth that was easier to forget than to claim. And after an hour of scrolling through search results, old forum threads, and barely functional people search sites, I found her. Claire Anderson, age 48, living in a small town just outside of Charlottesville. A yoga instructor. 2 daughters. Divorced. No mention of Dad. No mention of me. I stared at her profile picture for longer than I'd like to admit. Her smile was the same, though the lines around her eyes had deepened with time, and her hair was cut shorter now, neater. She looked grounded. Not happy exactly, but like someone who had built something real from the pieces she was given. Something I'd been trying to do my entire life while being told, in every possible way, that I'd never be enough unless I fit into a mold I didn't help make. And the question that began gnawing at me quietly at first, then louder, then unbearably, was this: why didn't Jake know about her? Because here's the thing, Jake and I were not close, but we grew up in the same house, went to the same schools, sat at the same dinner table. And yet somehow, the name Claire had never once crossed his lips. Not in childhood, not in passing, not even as an offhand joke the way older brothers sometimes mention forgotten relatives to assert their superior knowledge. Which meant Dad never told him. Which meant that everything I thought was a family secret had somehow only been my secret. Something Dad had slipped in front of me, shown me, then erased again without a trace. I texted Jake. Just 3 words. Did you know? He replied almost immediately, know what? So I called him. He picked up on the second ring, his voice tense, guarded. What's going on? And I said it, slow, deliberate, as if I were reading it off a page just to make sure it was real. Claire. Did you know about Claire? There was silence on the other end. Not the distracted kind, but the kind that sucks the oxygen out of the room and tells you that what you just said doesn't fit into the world the other person lives in. What are you talking about? He finally said, and I could tell he wasn't lying. So I told him. I told him about the day at the gas station, about the way Dad introduced her like she was an old coworker and not his daughter, about the box in the closet, about the birthday card with no stamp, about the letters he never opened. I didn't tell him about the photos I took. That part felt like mine. But I told him enough to shatter something. Jake didn't interrupt. He didn't argue. He didn't even breathe for a long stretch of it. When he finally spoke, he sounded smaller than I'd ever heard him, like a little boy caught in the realization that his superhero dad was just a man with too many locked doors. Why would he tell you and not me? Jake asked, and the pain in his voice made my throat tighten. I don't know, I said, and that was the truth. I didn't know. I still don't. Maybe because I was the one who asked questions. Maybe because I wasn't the favorite. Maybe because he figured I'd keep the secret and Jake wouldn't. Or maybe it was punishment, his way of burdening me with knowledge I couldn't use, couldn't explain, couldn't escape. Jake was quiet for a while, then said, he's still not talking. Mom says he hasn't eaten in 2 days. I didn't reply. Not right away. I thought about what it must be like inside that room, my dad alone, surrounded by memories he spent a lifetime trying to repress, thinking maybe he could outrun them if he just leaned hard enough into order, control, and the myth of his own authority. And now everything was unraveling. Not because someone betrayed him, but because someone finally saw him. And maybe that's what broke him. I'm going back tomorrow, I said to Jake. Not to check on him. To ask questions. Jake hesitated. Should I come? I didn't know if he meant it. I didn't know if he could handle it. But I also knew this wasn't just my story anymore. If you do, I said, you better be ready to hear the answers. Because now we weren't just 2 siblings navigating our father's favoritism. Now we were 2 people staring into a hole that had been dug long before we were born, a hole filled with decisions, betrayals, and silences that had shaped everything we thought we knew about who we were. And tomorrow, I was going to start digging. There's a moment, just before you cross the threshold of a house you grew up in but no longer belong to, where everything feels eerily suspended, like time itself holds its breath to see which version of you is going to walk through that door. The obedient child who once shrank to fit expectations, or the adult who has finally stopped apologizing for outgrowing them. That morning, as I stood in front of my parents' front door, staring at the brass doorknob that had barely changed since I was 8 years old, I knew something irreversible was about to happen, and for the first time in a very long time. I didn't feel afraid of it, I felt ready. I didn't knock. I walked in like I belonged there, even though deep down, I knew the version of me they had made space for had ceased to exist the moment I found that box in the closet. My mother was in the kitchen, her back to me, rinsing something in the sink that didn't need rinsing, and her shoulders were set in that stiff, defensive posture that always told me she was bracing for something she'd rather not face. She didn't turn around when she spoke, which told me she already knew it was me. "He hasn't come out," she said, her voice thin, like she was trying to make herself smaller by using less air. "He won't talk to me. Won't talk to anyone." "Did you know about her?" I asked, no preamble, no cushioning, because there's only so much soft delivery you can offer when the truth's been starved this long. She froze, hands still submerged in the sink, and when she finally did turn around, there was no feigned confusion or maternal concern. Just tired eyes that had seen far more than they'd ever admit to, and a mouth set in that tight line she reserved for moments when pretending stopped working. "I knew," she said, flatly. "I knew before we were even married." Her voice didn't tremble, and she didn't elaborate, which made it all the more infuriating, because I wanted details, I wanted confessions, I wanted the whole messy unraveling of the story they had buried under casseroles and Christmas cards, and that damn obsession with pretending we were a normal family. "You knew and you stayed?" I asked, even though I already understood the answer, because women of her generation didn't always have choices, they had duties, reputations, and private lives filled with compromise. "I stayed," she said, "because back then, a woman who left a man like your father didn't get praised for her strength, she got pitted, or worse, blamed. I stayed because it was easier. And because I thought he'd buried her." The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was loaded, thick, pressing in on all the things she wasn't willing to say out loud. She turned back to the sink, letting that be the end of it, and I didn't push her, because I knew that if I started pulling on her threads, she'd unravel in a way neither of us could recover from. I walked down the hallway, the same hallway where my father used to yell at Jake for tracking mud in from the backyard, the same hallway where I used to sit with my knees pulled to my chest, waiting for the arguments to end, and stopped in front of the closed bedroom door that had now become his refuge, his bunker, his self-imposed exile. I didn't knock. I leaned in close, rested my hand on the doorknob, and said quietly, "It's me." No answer. "I found the box," I continued, voice steady, not loud, but firm enough that I knew he could hear it through the door. "I saw the letters. The pictures. I know about Claire. I remember her. And I know you kept that from Jake. I know you made a choice." Still nothing. Not a sound. Not even the creak of a floorboard. "I don't know if you're hiding in there because you're ashamed," I said, pausing, listening, "or if you're scared of what happens now that the truth is out. But I'm not here to punish you. I'm here to get answers." The doorknob didn't move, and for a moment I thought he might not speak at all, might continue to rot behind that door like a relic refusing to face daylight. But then I heard it, barely a whisper, his voice, dry and hoarse, like it hadn't been used in days. "I didn't know how," he said. "I didn't know how to tell you." I stepped back, stunned more by the vulnerability in his tone than the words themselves. Because this wasn't the man I'd grown up with, the one who barked orders and handed out compliments like they were government-issued ration cards. This voice belonged to someone else entirely. Someone cracked open. The door didn't open, but he kept speaking, slow, like each syllable cost him something. "I was 21 when Claire was born. I was stupid. Arrogant. I didn't want to be a father. I told her mother I wasn't ready, and she raised Claire without me. I sent money sometimes. Cards. But I wasn't there. And when I married your mother, I convinced myself it was over, that I could start clean. I waited, giving him space, giving him silence where he might find the strength to keep going. But then she called me one day," he continued, "Claire. Said she wanted to meet. Said she had questions. I agreed. I brought you, remember? Said we were running errands. I thought maybe if I eased you into it, if you met her without knowing. I don't know. Maybe I was trying to rewrite something. Pretend it wasn't as broken as it really was." "I remember," I said, swallowing the knot in my throat. "You didn't say who she was." I asked, "and you told me she was someone from work." "I panicked," he admitted. "You looked at her, and I saw it, how alike you were. I didn't know what to do with that. So I buried it. I buried her again. I told myself it was kinder to keep it quiet. For whom? I asked, sharper than I intended. For everyone, he said. But mostly for me. There it was. The core of it. Not shame. Not guilt. But cowardice dressed up as protection, disguised as silence. Jake doesn't know, I said. I know, he replied. And now he will. And that's what I'm afraid of. You should have been afraid of not telling us, I said, turning to walk away. I didn't wait for him to come out. I didn't need to. The truth had been spoken, and once it's out, it doesn't go back into the box, no matter how much you want to tape the lid shut and pretend nothing happened. As I walked out of the house, past my mother still scrubbing an already clean dish, I didn't feel like a daughter anymore. I felt like someone who had survived something. And I wasn't done surviving yet. There's a peculiar kind of heaviness that settles in the space between revelation and resolution, like the world doesn't quite know what to do with you now that you've unearthed something it spent decades carefully hiding. And as I drove to meet Jake that Sunday afternoon, less than 48 hours after standing outside our father's door while he, for the first time in his life, admitted fear, I felt that weight not just in my chest, but in my bones, in my spine, in the way my fingers gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, as though I were trying to hold on to something solid when everything else suddenly felt fluid and uncertain. Jake had insisted we meet somewhere neutral, somewhere public, somewhere with noise and coffee and plausible deniability, because that's how he handles discomfort, with structure, with formality, with enough polite distance that no one can accuse him of feeling too much all at once. We met at a diner off the interstate, the kind with laminated menus that stick together and servers who wear their exhaustion like a uniform, and the second I walked in, I spotted Jake already seated at a corner booth, back straight, eyes tired. Stirring a coffee he wasn't drinking. He looked up as I approached, and for a moment, neither of us said anything, because what do you say when the entire framework of your shared history has just been rearranged in the span of a few days? He finally spoke first, his voice low, flat, almost rehearsed. So, Claire. I nodded and slid into the booth, not because I was ready, but because the only thing worse than starting was delaying. She's real, I said, not because he doubted it, but because some truths sound different when you say them aloud, heavier, more rooted, like they finally land somewhere permanent. Jake looked down at his hands, and I noticed for the first time that they were shaking slightly, the same hands that had once built science fair volcanoes and pitched no-hitters and signed contracts worth more than I'd ever seen in a single year. He never said a word, he murmured. Not once. And I thought we talked. I thought he trusted me. There was something deeply painful in the way he said it, not angry, not even bitter, just wounded in that unique way adult children feel when they realize their parents have been human all along, and not just flawed, but deeply incomplete, sculpted by their own fears and cowardice, and an entire generation's refusal to acknowledge emotional complexity. I don't think it was about trust, I said slowly. I think it was about shame. And convenience. And probably 100 other things we'll never get the full truth about, because Dad built his life on carefully selected half-stories. Jake looked up at me then, and for the first time in years, maybe ever, I saw something raw in his expression that wasn't pride or detachment or controlled disappointment. It was vulnerability, full and exposed and unguarded. Why you? He asked, not accusing, not hostile, but genuinely asking. Why did he let you see her? Why tell you and not me? I let the question hang in the air between us, thinking about that day at the gas station, the way Dad had watched me when I looked at Claire, the panic in his eyes, the speed with which he erased the moment and turned it into a memory we were supposed to forget. I think, because I was never the one he had to impress, I finally said, and the moment the words left my mouth, I knew they were true. You were the legacy. I was the margin of error. He could afford to slip up with me because no one was watching. No one was measuring. With you, he couldn't risk imperfection. Jake didn't respond right away, and when he did, it was just a nod, a small, quiet motion that said he understood more than he wanted to. We sat like that for a long while, The low hum of the diner around us a strange comfort, like background noise for a scene neither of us had been prepared to act out. Eventually, he leaned forward, voice tight. "Do you want to find her, Claire?" The question hit harder than I expected. Because part of me had already decided I did, but hearing him ask it, hearing him offer it, made it real in a way that felt both terrifying and inevitable. "I think I have to," I said. "Not just for me. Maybe for her. Maybe even for him." Jake let out a breath, almost a laugh, but not quite. "God, can you imagine? Showing up on her doorstep, saying, 'Hi, we're your half-siblings. Our father's been hiding you like a sin for the past 30 years, but hey, wanna grab coffee?'" And even though it was a joke, we both knew it wasn't far from the truth. Because that's what silence does. It doesn't just hurt the people who are kept in it, it radiates outward, into generations, into the way people build relationships, into the way they carry themselves and others, into the unspoken expectations they pass down like heirlooms no one wants, but no one knows how to refuse. I told Jake I'd reach out, and he said he wanted to be there when I did, and for the first time in our adult lives, we made a plan that didn't revolve around holidays, family obligations, or polite avoidance. As I drove home, the sun was already beginning to dip, casting long shadows across the road like echoes of the past trailing behind me, and I realized that, despite everything, I didn't feel broken. I felt alive, clear, like someone who had finally stood still long enough to hear the walls talk back. When I got home, there was a voicemail from my dad. Just one sentence. "I'm ready to talk." No apology. No explanation. Just 5 words. But they weren't empty. Because this time, he had reached out. This time, he had broken the silence. And maybe, just maybe, that's where the real story begins, not with a confrontation, not with revenge, not even with pain, but with the simple act of someone, after decades of pretending, finally choosing to speak. Not because he was forced, but because he was ready to be seen.